I'm sat here with Professor John Hughes, who's a professor of 19th century literature, but we're not talking about that, we're talking about Bob Dylan. It's much more exciting, to me at least. In a previous video, you linked Dylan with the cultural kind of world of the 1960s and said he was an important figure. In what ways was he kind of significant?
Yeah, he's obviously massively significant in that he's often said to have been the person who produced the anthems of that generation, and it was a generation that brought about huge kind of social and political change with the civil rights movement and, for instance, and resistance to the war in Vietnam, and kind of huge changes in the way in which, position of women and so on within and kind of and black people within American politics. And it's arguable that that Dylan's contribution to that was huge. I mean, not just him, but that he personally was at the vanguard of if you like, articulating attitudes that then became manifest in those sort of social and political changes. I suppose that one way of thinking about this would maybe just to think of a couple of examples that somebody might explore. Perhaps with a class in school or something, as a way of thinking about these things. And when we were talking a moment ago, before we started filming, we had a couple of ideas. And I suppose the first one that occurs to me is Dylan's very, very famous for songs like "Blowing in the Wind" and "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall" and "Masters of War." All of those were songs that were written around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually. And it'd be quite interesting to look at a song like "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall" and think of it as a response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and "Masters of War" was a song that he wrote during it, and all of that would be one sort of possibility. Another one that springs to mind is less about sort of war, but more about civil rights. When Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, Dylan was one of the few artists who was singing on the podium. So he was at the heart of that very seminal, crucial kind of cultural moment. But what's less well known, but I think really interesting, is that on the same day as the King's speech, he wrote what I think is one of his greatest early songs about racial discrimination, called "The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll." And I think it'd be really and it's also a very interesting song because, a bit like "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall," it's really open to literary analysis. You can do a lot by looking at it and looking at the patterns of language in it, and also the subtlety of description and the complexity of the situation, as well as the power of feeling that's invested in the death of Hattie Carroll, who's a black servant who's killed by a wealthy society man in a hotel in Baltimore. So it's a really great song. It's really open to analysis, and it's really interesting, I think, to ask what connection does that have with this wider situation and with what Martin Luther King was doing and all of that. And I suppose the other question that came to mind about you asking about the political thing would be to talk about the Vietnam War and the fact that by the mid-60s, Dylan had moved away from being identified with political causes in an obvious way. Although I think he still was always concerned with issues of personal freedom and self-exploration, all those kinds of things. But his silence on the Vietnam War is really quite an interesting sort of thing.
Well, I think even to us now,
ponder.
That's surprising, because when you think of political issues at that period, there are lots of them. The Vietnam War for North America stands out as the kind of the big one that everybody seemed to have an opinion on and stand one side. So Dylan's kind of almost refusal to stand where people expected him to stand kind of really marks him out. It's really kind of an interesting aspect.
He's almost completely silent on it. There is one verse in one song, Tombstone Blues, which I could tell you if you wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, he says, "The king of the Philistines, his soldiers to save, put jawbones on their tombstones and flattered the graves, put the Pied Piper in prison and fattened the slaves. and sent them out to the jungle. And then the next verse has something like, Gypsy Davy with his blowtorch, he burns out their camps. So he does kind of, in that
kind of
very sort of kind of slight surreal idiom that he's developed in the mid-60s, he does allude to it, and in a really powerful way. It's a wonderful song, Tombstone Blues. But that might be, for students of American culture, that would be an interesting song to look at and to think about, maybe in relation to the Vietnam War, and also to think about why it might be that we could still think of Dylan as being a powerful agent of change in the 60s, and yet reticent.
So he's not on marches, he's not at protests, he doesn't kind of stand up and make those statements.
No,
and that's really kind of... It's really kind of interesting that he doesn't
It's
do
really
that.
interesting. I think that we haven't got time to talk about it here, but I think that in a way, his faith with those sort of things manifests itself in different ways, rather than overt political, what he might have at that time seen as political posturing, and he didn't want to be co-opted as the voice of the generation and all of those.
Yeah, I think that there is something there about him not wanting to kind of fall into someone else's narrative about himself.
Yeah,
and it's kind of rather interesting.
And I've got a whole section in my book called Aversiveness, which is basically about, if you like, is how the idea that refusal in various ways is really important attitude for Dylan. It's really important to refuse to kind of be sort of pinned down by people.
Yeah, I think if you don't understand kind of Dylan, at least to some extent in terms of awkwardness, if that's the right, or refusal,
rejection.
If you don't get that, you kind of miss something fundamental about him and his kind of output, I think.
Yeah, which brings me back again to what I was saying in the other video about my basic idea is that Dylan is always criticising some previous state of affairs or distancing himself from it, and in terms of so as to embrace a more indefinite kind of future.
Thank you. And I think that shows, why Dylan's so... That anyone who wants to understand the 60s America, you shouldn't leave out Dylan.
No. And I mean, one final thing I will say, that it was very interesting when I was doing my book that I was able to communicate with several photographers that he knew at the time, who were kind of really... who knew him intimately and gave me quite a few kind of insights about his personality and character, and that was all kind of quite interesting too. You get a real flavour of the times talking to them and how much ferment there was. One of them still lives in Woodstock, is still an old hippie, by his own kind of admission. Elliot Landy is a great photographer and a really generous kind of man too, I discovered.
Yeah, I think you have to see that period very much as a very distinctive period, and Dylan at the heart of it.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you.